Thank you. Good morning. Thanks, Rosie. Yes, I would love to keep this very open. I'd love to take as many questions as you have. I guess the first thing to say about building a brand to last 100 years is I don't really know how to do that. I guess that's what we're trying to do. We have some thoughts on the topic, but it's only been about 9 years. I think we're in our ninth year now, so we're about 9% done with our plan. And I think the most you can say is that we're off to a pretty good start. But it's hard to know how the future 91 years will go. But we are trying to do something that's made to last. And I think just trying is interesting and gives you a type of discipline and a type of focus that's different from companies that I've run in the past that have really been much more short-term focused. Evernote is my third startup. The first one I started with a group of my friends right out of college, and we didn't really know what we would do. Our whole hypothesis was that we just wanted to see what it'd be like to have our own company. We didn't really have a mission or anything other than wanting to work for ourselves. And the main thing we learned from that company, which is called Engine 5 in Boston, is that it's really, really difficult to run your own business, to start a company. It's the hardest work that you'll ever do. We were working 16 hours a day for a few years. And we were building software for other clients. You know, we were making software for large retailers and stores. And what we learned is we weren't really making a product. We were basically consultants, which sucks. It feels like a false choice. You feel like you're working for yourself because it's your own company, but really you're not making anything of value. You're just billing hours more or less. And ultimately we sold that company, and so even the company wasn't for us. We decided to learn a lesson from that, and so really with the same people we started a second company called Core Street. The lesson we tried to learn from the first one was this time we would make a product. We said rather than just being programmers or consultants, we would actually try to make a product so we can try to actually accumulate some value. The value wasn't just based on the amount of hours that we put in. And that was also satisfying. We made software for banks and for governments. And the problem with that approach, even though we were making a product, is it still wasn't a product for us. We weren't a bank or a government, and so we didn't have any particular insight about what these customers wanted, and so we had to wake up every morning and think, what do banks want? What do governments want? And it turns out that also got pretty boring. It isn't how I wanted to spend most of my days. And so we were fortunate enough to also be able to sell that company. And then when it came time to do it for a third time, we said, well, we learned a couple of lessons. We learned that we want to make a product if we're going to work this hard, but also this time around we want to really try to make something for ourselves. So that instead of trying to ask, what does the customer want? What does the market want? We thought we would just ask, well, what do we want? And we would try to build something for us. And we thought that maybe, our hypothesis was that maybe this was actually the right time to do something like this. This was back in 2007. We were really just getting started with Evernote. Because we thought the world was maybe changing in an interesting way, where if you build something for yourself, if you build something that you love, because of the way the world seemed to be starting to be wired up with social media, everyone would find out about it. So we thought maybe if we built something that we'd love, maybe there'd be another billion people in the world that would love it as well, and they'd be able to get it and find out about it and pay for it. So before this advice of building something for yourself was probably bad advice for starting a company, we thought maybe this was becoming more practical now. And so when we created Evernote, or kind of recreated the current company known as Evernote, in '07, we really set out to do something that was for us. So we wanted to build the product that we wanted to have. We wanted to build a company that we wanted to keep. We didn't want to start the company with the intention of selling it, but the intention of doing something long term, and we've been thinking about that ever since. And I think we're a little bit closer to figuring out what that means, although there's still vastly more questions than answers. So with that, I would love to open up the floor for questions and really talk about anything that you guys are interested in. Assuming anyone is interested in anything. If not, that's also cool. think there's a microphone so that they can get you on camera.
Phil, can you talk a little bit about how your company's culture has changed as you've grown?
It's a really good question. So I used to worry a lot about how to preserve the culture. We're about 400 people now, and so we're in a very awkward stage of the company. In fact, lots of CEOs that I've talked to who run much larger, more important companies than ours, universally they kind of say that the 300 to 500 person stage is the hardest time. They say like, oh, it's really like you're not tiny anymore. You're sort of big enough where all of the DNA that you had as a startup just isn't really working. A lot of the team that started with you isn't the right team anymore. Things feel like they're getting big, but you're actually not big enough yet either. So you don't usually have people who are really good at process. And so the kind of that 300 to 500 stage is an awkward stage, and it becomes a lot smoother once you're coming on the other side of that with a couple of thousand people. And so I used to worry a lot about how do we preserve the startup culture. How do I keep things from changing? And then I realized that was probably the wrong way to think about it. It's not my job to preserve anything. I don't want to preserve the culture. I think if you try to preserve it, it just becomes brittle and it kind of cracks. I think a better way to think about it is that the culture is going to evolve, and it's my job as the executive of the company to decide how it should evolve, to kind of give a direction and guidance change rather than trying to hold back the change. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about what is our culture not good at yet, and what do we want to improve, and what do we want to get better at, and then intentionally trying to move there rather than trying to hold something back and then just complain about how we're getting bigger and doesn't feel like the same company. Most recently, we realized that we weren't particularly good at making data-driven decisions, which is kind of surprising for a Silicon Valley company. There's definitely a fetish in Silicon Valley around making every decision based on A/B tests and split tests and results, and we just really weren't doing that at all for almost anything. And so about a year and a half ago, we decided we needed to get much better at that, and we made a very conscious evolution where now we're doing more and more things based on data. And then I've sort of got my list of other things that we suck at that I want to evolve, and we're working towards that. So I think it's kind of a mistake to lament the change of culture. I think instead I should try to push it forward in the direction that I want it to go. Please, up there. And maybe just wait for the microphone. Do they need the microphone, or is it okay to?
You never want to hear me?
Yeah. Oh, it's for the video. Okay, so please.
Thank you. This is a bit of an open-ended question, but
Excellent.
I would just love to hear a little bit more of a story around Evernote. How it started. Did you guys all get together and were like, okay, we're going to research a really good idea, and then just a story from like start to now, really.
Oh, okay. Well,
not.
The first 9 years.
But just a bit more context on, I think.
So there's actually two different teams that came together to make what Evernote is now. There was a team of people that was founded in, I think, 2005 by a guy named Stepan Pachikov, who was a famous Russian-American entrepreneur and inventor. And he had a group of people that came together in the late 80s that Apple actually brought out of what was in the Soviet Union to work in the Apple Newton, which I think you guys are all probably too young to remember, but the Apple Newton was like the first tablet PC. It was kind of way ahead of its time, like 20 years ahead of its time. And this team of people had stayed together more or less intact. And they were working on their new idea, which was a way to give people what they described as photographic memory, a way to sort of improve everyone's memory. And then in 2007, I was just wrapping up my second startup with kind of my team of people. We were in Boston, they were in California. And we sat around with kind of my friends and co-founders and said, well, what do we want to build? And like I said before, we were thinking of, we want to make something for ourselves. Like this was our third company, and we said, okay, we'd sort of been fortunate the first two, but we never felt like we were making something for ourselves. What do we make for ourselves? What do we want to build? And we just kind of went down the list. We just made a list of things that we were interested in. And so for first we thought, well, we all really like video games. Maybe we'll make a video game. And said, man, well, like I've already got this giant stack of video games that I haven't had time to play. There's already such great games. we probably aren't going to contribute much to the world by making other video games. So then we thought, well, we really like some of the new social media stuff. Maybe we should make something social. And we thought, well, but there's already MySpace, and you can't really beat MySpace. That seemed kind of hopeless, and so we decided not to try making anything social. And then we thought, well, all of us were nerds, and we thought that our experience with productivity software is actually kind of bad. Like, we all used lots of productivity applications, and they just kind of suck. They seem old. Even in 2007, they seemed old-fashioned. They seemed like the ideas hadn't advanced very much since Microsoft Office pretty much defined what it meant to be productivity software. But that was 30 years ago. That was a generation ago. And we thought, and this is something that we would like to improve. We ourselves would like to use technology to make our brains work better. And it didn't seem like there had been much innovation in that space in 30 years. And so we thought an area that we want to use and we use every day, but that hasn't seen much innovation in a generation, is a good area to get into. So we started working on a company that we were going to call Ribbon. The original name was supposed to be Ribbon, like a ribbon that you tie around your finger to remember something. And very quickly I ran into, in my doing due diligence, we ran into the other team in California. It was led by Stepan. We got together in 2007 and decided to merge the two teams and kind of make one company. So we did that in 2007, made a company called Evernote. And we started, we were initially self-funded, so we had put in some money ourselves, and we had some friends and family, but we were always in the mode of trying to raise money from the beginning. And it was really tough. We were raising money. We were trying to do our first serious round in 2008, right at the very heart of the economic collapse, the market collapse back in 08. In fact, and our structure was kind of complicated because we had two different teams that came together. It was an unconventional structure. We didn't have like the standard Silicon Valley, a couple of co-founders with some angel investors. We had a more complicated cap table, and that was a big mistake too, because it turns out that for a lot of investors, if you're unconventional in some way, if you have a structure that's unusual, it's just really not worth their time to understand it. So until you can show that you're sort of worth their time to like go through and understand why you're different, it's just a major handicap. And so that, plus the bad economic times, plus I was just terrible at actually pitching or raising money. We were constantly on the verge of running out of money. We never had more than a few weeks of cash left in the bank. And at one point, and some of you may have heard this story, we finally got a term sheet for a very large round of investment, I think $10 million. And we had to work for about 9 months in the due diligence to get it, because there's a lot of things we had to clean up before we could take that money. And finally, on the day that we were supposed to close the funding and get $10 million, that was the day that Lehman Brothers collapsed and the stock market plunged. And our investor called on the day of closing and said, we just lost 60% of our fund value, and we're backing out of the deal. We're not going to do the investment. At that point, we had 3 weeks of cash left in the bank. And so I spent the next week frantically just calling everyone I know, trying to keep the company afloat. We were already like 20, 25 people at that point, so it was a lot of salaries to pay and things like that. And no one would even return our calls. It was hopeless. And so a week later, with about 2 weeks of cash left in the bank, I decided that was it. We had to shut down the company because we didn't want to literally run out of money. You had to like pay your last bills and stuff, or else you'd go to jail or something. So we thought we'd spend the last little bit of cash we had to sort of settle our affairs. And I remember it was about 3 a.m. and I finally decided, okay, I'm going to close my laptop. I'm going to go to bed. And I'm going to wake up in the morning, and I'm going to go to work, and I'm going to lay everyone off. I'm going to shut down the company. And I remember at that point thinking, like reflecting that, like, oh, this must be what it feels like to be an adult. Like I kind of, and it felt like an adult for the first time in my life. And I remember thinking, like, this is terrible. I never want to be an adult again. But right before going to bed at 3 a.m., I get an email from a random guy in Sweden. And the email said, "Hi Phil, I'm a random guy from Sweden, and I'm just writing to tell you that I love Evernote. I've been using it for a couple of months now, and it's changed my life. It's made me so much more productive. I'm so much happier. I just wanted to tell you that you have a great product. And that made me feel a little bit better. And I remember thinking, like, oh, like if you improve the life of one random guy from Sweden, you've done something. But then he went on to say in the email, so I'm just writing to check to see if you need any investment. And I wrote back to him at like 3:10 a.m. I was like, why, yes, we do need investment. And I stayed up instead of going to bed, and 20 minutes later we were on a Skype call. And about 2 weeks after, he sent us $500,000. So he invested $500,000. And it kept us alive. It kept us alive for about 6 months, which was long enough to actually have enough traction, because we had just released the product a few months earlier. It was enough to give us enough traction to actually kind of get through the worst time and raise money. And so probably the biggest lesson from that I'll just remember forever, and this is just generally good advice, is always answer emails from Sweden. If you take nothing else out of your Oxford experience, that ought to be it. And from then on, it became, the funding became easier and easier, and everything else kind of became harder and harder, because it actually turns out that, like, as difficult as it is to raise money, it's like the easiest thing that you'll ever do in your company, because it's a lot easier than actually building something or running something. You have this, like, the nice thing about fundraising is you have this very clearly defined fitness function. You're like, you have a goal. You're like, I have to raise this much money by this date, and if you do, you're like, okay, success. And like pretty much nothing else is like that. So if you guys are about to start companies, some of you, or you have, and you're kind of dreading the experience of fundraising, you should know that, yeah, it is pretty difficult, but it's also like the most fun you'll ever have, and it all gets much worse after that. So that's to look forward to. And then, so that was in 2008. And after that, it's been, it's been pretty good. It's just basically been a steady series of trying to make the product a little bit better and a little bit better, and moving into larger and larger space and getting more and more people. Really thinking hard about trying to make something that has a chance of lasting, like trying to make a company that's bigger than me and then the rest of the people in it, which is an interesting way of thinking about things. Please.
Hi. Could you describe the process that you and your team went through to build the Evernote brand, to make it known, to get some critical mass?
Yeah, so we had a pretty specific strategy about it. We got really lucky with the logo. The Evernote logo, I think, it's really good. The identity, the visual identity is great. And it was a lot of luck, but it was pretty intentional. Like we knew that it was important, we hired this great designer that we knew. That was a friend of ours, who I think he was working for Apple, or he had just finished at Apple, and we couldn't afford him. It was very, very expensive. But we said, hey, could you make us a logo and an identity? We can't really afford to pay you what you normally make. And he said, yeah, I like you guys. So how much money do you have? And we had $10,000 at that point. So I said, well, we have $10,000. And he said, all right, I'll do it for $10,000. So I learned an important negotiating lesson. But I also gave him, we gave him our last $10,000 to make the logo. And I talked about it a little bit yesterday for any of you who attended the session, but he came up with a few hundred variations, and we sort of settled in on an elephant, and then there was a long process of going with the elephant, but then trying to make the elephant look less like the Republican Party elephant and more like the Evernote elephant. And that worked really well. And we specifically in that process were guided by principles like, what do we want the brand to convey? What do we want what is the primary emotion that we want associated with the brand? And I've done this a few times before at other companies, and in other companies we always had like way too many words. Where you say like, okay, what emotion do you want the brand to convey? And it's like you come up with this like list of 20 words. Like it's got to be cool and high tech, and we basically realized you can't have more than one. Like usually your brand, or at least your logo, your identity, won't convey anything. You're lucky if you can get it to convey one thing. So you should just really focus on like, what is that one thing? And you don't get two things, you just get one thing. And so we thought, okay, it's trust. Like what we want the logo and the identity to convey is trust. and that's it. We don't want it to convey high tech or advanced or cool or fun or anything like that. Just trust. And that very specifically influenced the colors, the font choice, kind of the way things are proportionally to each other. And it was a process that took a couple of months to get it right. And it was the last $10,000 we had, but it was really worth it because I think we came up with something that's been worth easily hundreds of millions of dollars just in brand equity and just in free marketing that we got for having that. The way that we made and I know you asked about brand, and I'm talking about logo, which is just a very small subset of it. The way that we thought about the next important visual piece of the brand was the app icon. The app icon we got really lucky in. Like the original Evernote app icon on the iPhone in the App Store was just really, iconic. And we realized how important it was going to be because we knew that Apple had just launched the iPhone, and we figured that most of their early marketing was just going to be showing app icons. That it was just all going to be like billboards with just like app icons, and we're like, we just always want Evernote to be prominently featured in those app icons. And yeah, like the first 2 years of Apple marketing for the iPhone was all app icons, and later they shifted to screenshots and later to other things, but initially it was all app icons. And so we tried to come up with visual rules for what we could make that would make it stand out. So we thought, first of all, we had to be, it had to be large and identifiable. We didn't want to have any like tiny little details. It had to like work at different sizes. More importantly, and this is something that I think a lot of people miss, it had to read as a primary color. Because when you think about how a designer would make like a giant billboard, let's say you were going to cover a convention center with app icons. Like, how would you do it? How would you lay it out? It's not accidental. Or let's say you were going to run like a magazine spread, for Christmas 2009, and you was going to have an iPhone. It was sort of wrapped up in like a bow of app icons, which they did in like 09 and 010. How would you choose those? You would choose them. You would lay out icons kind of by color, and so you needed to have a primary color that would fit like into the color palettes that a company was likely to choose. And if you had more than one kind of primary color, then it would never fit anywhere, and you would get thrown out. So there's a lot of little considerations like that, which were kind of subtle, but worked out really well. On a larger scheme, our marketing strategy in the first few years was very specific. We said we were going to pretty much kill ourselves to have our app ready on day one of every major device or app store launch, so we would benefit from basically from the launch publicity. So, we were on iPhone on the very first day. We were on iPad on the very first day. We were on Android, not on the first day, but very close. We were on, the BlackBerry something on the first day. This was, and not only did we really try hard to have our apps be on all these new platforms and devices on the first day, we made native versions for each one. So right from the beginning, we didn't do any cross-platform development. I'm a programmer by background. I'm an engineer. I never thought that it was my job to make life easier for my programmers. And any kind of attempt at cross-platform development, I think is optimizing for the wrong thing. I think if you try to develop for multiple platforms kind of in the same way, you wind up with the lowest common denominator approach. You wind up building for whatever is the worst. And so you're just not going to get a great experience. And so back then, everyone else was doing web apps, which was by definition lowest common denominator, and we didn't do that. We said everything is native, everything is like written to the metal, basically, for each platform, which is far more expensive. But we thought if we did that and we got the native apps on each device on the day it came out, all of the manufacturers would want to showcase us because it would be the best experience on their device and their platform. And they've all had billions of dollars of marketing budgets, and we had nothing. So we can spend a few $100,000 extra on a few engineers, but we would get millions and millions of dollars of marketing as a result of it. So that was a strategy, and that worked really well. That worked really well for I would say 4 or 5 years. Probably 4 years. I don't know that it works so well these days. Like, I don't know if that would be my advice today. Just because I think, again, the timing was good for us. Evernote was coming to life right as new devices and app stores were happening. It doesn't happen as often anymore. I mean, you see things like the Apple Watch launch earlier this year, which we were on day one. But for the most part, it's not as common anymore. So I don't know that would be as as big a part of our strategy going forward. But our initial marketing strategy was the product is the marketing. Like we spent no money on marketing, all the money on product, and then all of our marketing was basically talking about the product and really letting our partners, our manufacturers and distributors, carriers, platforms, do the talking for us because they use this as an example. Only a few years later did we actually start investing in more specific marketing, which was mostly media, social media, public relations, stuff like that, which became very effective. So that's kind of how we thought about the evolution of it. Now we're in a pretty different phase. So I think the stuff that worked for us early on, it still works, but it's just proportionally, it's just nowhere near as big as it used to be. It used to be a big deal for us. Like we would get mentioned in a story in the New York Times, and our download numbers would spike. And that just doesn't happen anymore. I mean, we get mentioned in a story in the New York Times, and maybe an extra 10,000 people or 50,000 people download us over the scope of a few days, but we get over 100,000 new users every day. So it just doesn't, like, the things that we used to lean on to move the numbers aren't as significant anymore proportionally. Now we have to lean on other things. The main other thing, the only thing that really scales with volume is network effects. It's basically viral distribution. Like everything else isn't scalable. The only thing that's scalable is getting your users to invite their friends and coworkers. And so now we're focusing a ton on the product to introduce those network effects. And we've only been doing that for about 6 or 7 months, and it's been I think relatively successful. I'd like to see us do a lot more, but it's been a decent start. Oh, hey.
So what do you think for the next 5 or 10 years the collaboration software is going to play out, and what's your vision on that?
I think the next 5 to 10 years is going to be very interesting for collaboration software. We have a couple of thoughts about that. One is I think there's kind of two different strands here. Which I think often get conflated when people talk about collaboration and productivity. There is a general desire that a lot of people feel for connecting with other people, for talking, for collaborating, for sharing, for kind of establishing that human bond, that human connection to somebody else. That's a feeling that I understand in the abstract, but pretty much don't share, ever. Like I really don't want to spend more time talking to people or collaborating. I kind of, for the most part, want to be left alone and just accomplish something. And I think almost everyone has both sides of that. Almost everyone has the extroverted side where for your friends you kind of want to connect, and then there's your work where it isn't so much that you don't want to connect, but that isn't the primary goal. You just want to accomplish. And Evernote is very solidly in the side of just accomplishing, not connecting for the sake of connecting. When we started out, we were militantly so. In fact, we would say all the time, back in 07, 08, 09, everything else was social. Everything else that was being pitched to VCs at the time was, Facebook for dogs and stuff like that. And we would specifically say, just to be different, we would say Evernote isn't social. In fact, we'd say Evernote is antisocial. Evernote doesn't care about your friends. Evernote doesn't care about your friend's dog. We care about you. We care about what's in your brain. We care about you actually doing something substantive and accomplishing something. And a lot of the core value that we build is because of that. Like people right now, we have more than 100 million users. The majority of them think of Evernote as my important stuff. But this has also been a limitation for us. Because of that dynamic really inhibits the network effects, the viral effects that I was just talking about. It's difficult to grow when your user base thinks of you as sort of my important stuff. So even though almost all of our growth is organic, meaning we grow by people finding us in app stores and telling their friends about it, most people don't use Evernote with their friends or coworkers. They maybe tell them about them because they love it, which is great, but they're not using it, they're not pulling people in. So what we've really tried to do in the past couple of years is extend that definition from saying it isn't so much that we are antisocial, It's that we want you to accomplish something. We want you to be able to achieve. We want you to be able to get your life's work done. And very often, to achieve something important, especially something important at work, you have to work with other people. And so we want to make that as effective and automatic as possible. We want you, in using Evernote, it's not a way for you to say more. In fact, it's probably a way for you to say less, but get the same amount of work done. This is, I think, a different philosophy that separates us from a lot of other apps and tools that are primarily about communication, like, for example, Slack. Slack has been a fantastically successful company in the past year and a half or something, really focused on letting people talk, which is great, and it's understandable why it grows so fast. But I think in the long term, that isn't actually what you need for productivity. What you need is doing, like more doing, less talking, or just enough talking to make the doing better. I think there's basically an old paradigm for how all of this works and a new paradigm. And the old paradigm is that you have separate tools for every aspect of getting something accomplished. So the old paradigm is you write in Microsoft Word, and you store that file in, let's say, Dropbox, and you talk about it in email, or more recently in Slack. And that's fine, except that approach really only works on the desktop, on desktop computers. It really, like, having those three distinct things really only works when it's pretty easy to, like, alt-tab over to a different app and cut and paste URLs and move things around. It doesn't really work on mobile, and it doesn't even begin to make sense, on wearables, when you're just going to be surrounded by devices. So our long-term product hypothesis is that an integrated approach of authoring and talking in the same experience is going to win over a siloed approach where you write in one way and you store in a different way and you talk about it in a third way. And I think that's where the direction is going to go. So I think something like Slack is successful and growing quickly because it's the behavior that people are used to, but it's also, I think, like the last really successful product of the old paradigm. And I think as more and more things shift to mobile and wearable, the integrated products, like what we're doing, like what Quip is doing, are more in the right direction and are going to prevail. So that's kind of our medium-term strategy. And then we have lots of specific ways of thinking about how to do that, how to let you kind of collaborate without collaborating. But those are specific product details. Please, up there.
How do you preempt what might kill Evernote, whether it's a behavior change, a brand relevance issue, competition, change in system, device? How are you preempting long-term what could kill your company?
Well, you try to kill it yourself. I think that's really the only legitimate answer, right? This is like what I said about culture. Like, if you can't save anything, you can't protect anything. You shouldn't try. You can only decide how things are going to evolve, and then you need to be the person or the company evolving it. So I hope that the thing that makes relevant seem, I hope that the thing that makes Evernote seem, obsolete and slow and irrelevant is, the next version of Evernote or a future product that we make. And there's always a danger that it won't be that'll be somebody else. But I think the only way to, we aren't trying to fight it. We are trying to be it. And that becomes, in some ways, harder, in some ways, easier. There's this. I said yesterday in my talk here, but my favorite definition of entrepreneurship at a Harvard Business School is this line that entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. So the idea, and that's what makes it so easy to be entrepreneurial at a startup, because when you don't control anything, you don't have to regard it. You just think about what you want to do and you just pursue it ridiculously without worrying about what you have. But as you actually start having stuff, it becomes harder and harder not to think about it. It becomes harder and harder not to think about protecting your stuff while pursuing opportunity, and that's why it's so much harder for big companies to be entrepreneurial and to be innovative than small companies who basically don't have a choice. So when you kind of go on that spectrum, you have, let's say you go on the spectrum of productivity products today. You've got you've got sort of small companies that have only been around for a year or two, like let's say Slack or Quip, and it's pretty easy for them to make very quick product changes because they don't have anything. They don't really have, well, Slack now has traction, Quip still doesn't. But there's not much to protect. So it's all about innovation. You just try to make something really shiny. And then you've got like Microsoft that has 30 years of installed customers to protect. And Microsoft is trying very hard to actually innovate, but man, that's difficult because anything they do, they've got the burden of 30 years of decisions weighing on them. And we're somewhere in the middle. I think we're much closer to the start there than to the end. But we've got some tens of millions of really passionate active users. 140, 150 million total users, and we have to make this balance really carefully. Because on the one hand, if we just start over from scratch, if we're just like let's forget about everything we've done in the past, let's just completely start over, blank slate, then we've got something like Quip, which is a nice product, but not going anywhere because it's just like it lacks the traction or the installed base. So like our users are the assets, and yet we have to be able to bring them into a new way of doing things. And finding that balance is tough, but we have to be the ones that find it and not basically focus on protecting our own position and therefore letting somebody else come in and disrupt us. So I've actually just started a project at Evernote where I'm spending the past couple of weeks, actually for the next few months, I'm going to be spending the majority of my time, probably 80% of my time, heading up an effort to come up with the next big set of products for us. I've tried to structure my executive team so that I can do that, and then I'm actually spending most of my time working on what is the thing that's going to kill Evernote, because I want that thing to be us. Hello.
Siri wanted to ask you a question.
Yes, Siri.
That's okay.
I hope everyone goes to Lila's class. It's after this, right? Or you? It's gonna be much better.
You started to answer my question anyway, but I'm sorry, I missed the very beginning, so you might have touched on this regarding culture. But you are CEO. What do you define your CEO job as in terms of, some CEOs say managing culture is my number one thing. Some, you're saying you're going to spend 80% of your time looking at the future. How do you decide how to spend your time, and what do you see as the key parts of your job?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I don't think there's like a single recipe for that. I think there's different people are effective at wildly different models of being CEO. And probably most importantly, I would say I don't see CEO as a job title. I don't see that as being the definition of what I am. Like my contribution to Evernote is not primarily as CEO, which is a job function. It's as a co-founder. It's as myself. I happen to be occupying the function called CEO. In the future, there will be other people who are CEOs. The whole point of trying to build a 100-year company is that it gives you the discipline to say it can't be about any individual. I must not be the last CEO of Evernote. If I'm the last CEO of Evernote, then we've probably failed to make a 100-year company. I'm probably not the CEO in 92 years. Still hope to be involved in the company in some way. Hopefully as like a disembodied head and like a robot spider body or something. In other words, on the board of directors. But I'm probably not going to be the CEO then. And at some point, it's my job. It's in fact a very big portion of my job to find someone who's going to be a better CEO than I am to run the company. And I think what you need in the CEO position really changes pretty radically from phase of the company to phase of the company and from person to person. I think there are going to be lots of different styles that are successful in it. My primary contribution has been in the user experience and then a product strategy. I think I do my best work when I'm thinking maybe 18 to 24 months out. And lately I haven't been. Lately for the past year and a half or 2 years, I've been spending most of my time thinking about things that are like next week or next month, and that's frustrating. I don't think that's super effective. So I've been trying over the past year or so to kind of restructure things so that I can kind of pop back up and do things slightly longer term, not like not super futurist things, but like 18 to 24 months is kind of the sweet spot for me. There are other people who are most effective thinking kind of this quarter, and there's people who are effective thinking 10 years out. I think early on, as a founder, your primary responsibility is recruiting the rest of the team. Like, no matter what else you're good at, your primary responsibility is like finding people who are smarter than you, getting them to work for you, making sure they have enough coffee to, to move the world a little bit, keeping them, happy and productive, knocking down obstacles or barriers to people being productive at work. And that's it in the early days. It's team building, it's recruiting, and then plus whatever else. So if you're a good product person, you could be a CEO if you're good at team building plus product, and then you can have other people handling, finance and operations and sales. If you're a really strong, operations person, you can do team building and operations, and you get somebody else to handle, product and sales and everything else. So you sort of do team, whatever else you're good at, and build a team around it, and then move on, in a few years when it's time to bring on a better person. Please.
So thanks for being here. 2 questions on funding. So you mentioned on the first slide you got this funding from this Swedish guy. So how did you make sure that you don't end up giving more equity, or he doesn't use your situation into his benefit, basically? That's the first thing. And how did you get your subsequent rounds of funding? How did you choose the right partners in terms of funding? Because that's another critical part of getting a successful venture.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the first part of your question.
So in the first question, you were desperate of getting funding, right?
Yeah.
And you told the story about the Swedish guy. So how did you make sure that you don't end up giving more equity to him what you should be giving, just to get some funding out of it?
Oh, wow.
Or choosing the wrong partner who can kill the company, let's say, within few months, if not days.
Well, I think, when it's 3 a.m. and you're about to come in and lay everyone off, and, one person in the world offers you money, he's the right partner. And he actually happened to be. I actually only recently got to meet him in person. We've obviously talked lots of times on Skype, but I only actually met him for the first time like 6 months ago. And he's a very cool guy. And we just got very lucky. I mean, there's no, that story is not there's no management genius on my part. That's just dumb luck. There's just luck and occasionally checking email, and that's it. And I never worried, and maybe this is to my detriment, but I never worried too much about dilution. I never worried too much about giving too much away. Maybe I should, and maybe that'll come back and bite me later. But there's multiple schools of thought about this. There's lots of founders and CEOs who basically control the company with an iron fist, and there's a lot to be said for that approach. It isn't what I've done. I've always tried to optimize for the chances of being successful, not the magnitude of the financial rewards for that success if it were to happen. So I would rather give away more if it increases the chances of making something great, and then wind up with less proportionally than hold 98% of a company that at the end of the day isn't worth anything. And I know that's kind of a stark way of putting it. There's always a middle ground. But in my own head, I've never really negotiated very hard for valuation for anything like that. In fact, we've never really had a valuation negotiation. We've sort of picked the investors first, and then we've gotten the best terms we can get from the investors we wanted, not the other way around. We haven't tried to pit investors against each other to get the best possible terms. Because I think the second part of your question is exactly right. Getting the right investors, getting the right partners is long-term much more important. That's what's going to maximize your chance of success, not what kind of terms you can squeeze out of them. This is particularly important now when valuations are really going up, and people are often confused, especially in the media, about what valuations actually mean, especially the difference between public company and private company valuations. You hear things like. This company's worth $1 billion or $50 billion or whatever. You compare that to public companies. And what does that actually mean? I think valuations for a public company mean something pretty specific. A valuation for a publicly traded company is a market price. It's basically the average of a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers, and there's sort of a consensus price about how much a stock is worth. valuation for a private company, especially one that's fairly early stage, there's typically only one seller, or only one seller at any scale, which is the company. And so the valuation isn't the average between what buyers and sellers are willing to pay, it's whatever is the highest price you can get somebody to offer you. So you only need like one crazy investor to give you a really high valuation, then you can be worth as much as the craziest person is willing to pay. And so, but if you optimize your private company valuation on what the craziest investor is willing to pay, you can get a high valuation and you wind up diluting yourself very little, but then you wind up with a crazy person on your board. And long term, that's not great. That's probably liable to cost you a lot more. So what we've always done is we've selected the investors first. We've kind of said like, okay, these are the really desirable investors. We want to work with you. All of them have been Evernote users. We've never taken money from anyone who hasn't been a rabid fan of the product. I find it hard to talk to people who don't use the product. Like we don't speak the same language. And then given the investors that we want, we then find terms that, that work for us. And even when it comes to negotiating terms, valuation is usually like last place. Like other terms in a term sheet, I don't know how much you guys know about term sheet terms. I don't want to get too arcane about liquidation preferences and drag-alongs and all of that kind of stuff. But the number that your company's worth is pretty much the least important term, financial term. Other things are much more important. Things like liquidation preferences, which basically specify what happens in case you go public, or what happens if your next valuation is a little bit lower than your first one. There's all sorts of these like structured deals that maybe look good on paper if you're only looking at one number, which is the valuation, but which are actually horrible deals in every other way. And so in order of importance, we always optimize for who is the investor first, and then make sure the terms are super clean. And by clean, I mean that the interests are aligned as much as possible. Of course, there's preferred stock and common stock, but we try to, as much as possible, make sure that the investor has exactly the same interest and outcomes as we do. And a lot of people screw that up. There's a lot of deals out there where the interests are really unaligned. What? Soon all of us will be obsolete. You could go to Oxford, or you could just look something up on Wikipedia. And so it's who the investor is first, the quality of the terms second, and then the actual valuation is sort of dead last in importance for us. Please.
Speaking of investors and 100 years of brand, how do you go beyond the exit strategy? If you, let's say you want to keep your company, how do you approach investors? Because I'm in that situation right now, and they're saying, what's your exit strategy? And I'm like, well, actually, I just want to keep it for a while.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I really think exit, the word exit is a really, it's kind of unfortunate. I think it's actually sort of a pernicious word in this context. I think the word exit has come from investment lingo, and it's polluted entrepreneurial thought. Exit is a financial concept. It isn't an entrepreneurial concept. And they're really talking about two different things. The better way to think about it is just to change words. Instead of thinking about exit, thinking about liquidity. And then all the problems just like melt away, and then everything is fine. Because of course investors want liquidity, and they're entitled to liquidity. But it's not an exit. It's not like the end of anything, other than if they choose to exit their investment, they can get money back. And a company, you should design multiple points of liquidity in that journey, and never call them exits, because it just like entirely sends the wrong message. So we have no exit strategy. Evernote is our life's work. We don't need an exit strategy for your life's work. But we should design liquidity points all the way through. So most rounds that we've done of financing, we've done both primary and secondary, which means that primary is when the company sells stock to get money for operations. Secondary is when existing investors and employees and founders sell some of their stock, which the company doesn't benefit from, but it gives liquidity to the early shareholders. And so we've done that a few times. And the idea is just to keep doing that, to have multiple rounds of primary and secondary, giving investors the opportunity to sell some or all of their holdings to later investors. And then ultimately, of course, if you go public, that's not an exit. Like going public isn't an exit, it's just another liquidity event. The way that we think about going public, and we don't have any plans immediately, although we would like to deserve to be a great public company. I think we have an almost moral obligation to be a public company at some point. But the way that we think about that is any shareholder on the day of IPO that really like needs to sell on the day of IPO, I would much rather that those people have sold earlier. So we want to have a series of financings, ideally giving some liquidity at each stage, leading up to an IPO and then past an IPO. And when investors ask about exit, that's really like they're really asking about liquidity, and that's how I would advise you talk about it. But then say in terms of exit for yourself, for the employees, for the founders, well, we're not looking for an out. I usually make a joke about it. The way to divert attention from that is to say when people ask about my exit strategy, I say I'm still working on my entrance strategy. It doesn't mean anything, but people kind of laugh at it, and then the topic goes away. So.
We have 10 more minutes, so maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Please.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
You mentioned that there were 2 teams working on the prototype for Evernote, and then you merged into one team. How do you manage, I'm guessing it's a big pool of founders then.
Yeah.
How do you manage the whole team? How do you align each other? And what are the tips to choosing the correct founders and co-founders to make the best team possible?
Yeah. Manage is maybe an overly generous word for what that's like. I don't think we necessarily managed anything, but we have like 13 co-founders at Evernote, and it's a big team, and not all of them are still here. Many of them are, but there's kind of 2 schools of thought on this. It's like if you've got a band, like are you hiring the bandmates for the music you want to play, or you're like writing the music for the band that you have? And early on, especially if it's like your first time or your second time, or for me, my third time, you're really writing music for the band you have. It's like, I want to work with these people. It's like, these are my friends. These are the people that for whatever reason, like I can hang out with and talk to. And we want to work together in a meaningful way, and we kind of have a shared understanding of what that means. And so it's about like, it's not about finding the right people. At the early stage, for me, it wasn't about finding the right people for the opportunity. It was about finding the opportunity for the people. And then later that evolves and that changes, because if you actually have some success in this opportunity, then now you have obligations to other people. Now you have investors, you have customers, you have other obligations, and then it becomes, okay, how do you actually adjust the group and manage them and bring on new people and fire people who were there from the beginning who weren't the right people? So that you can start, now that you've sort of established the music that you're playing, you can't keep changing the music. Now you have to, hire the right band members, and that, and that transition is difficult. It takes years. It's for me personally the only deeply unpleasant part. Like the only thing that really, really stresses me out is exactly this question. It's exactly okay, now that I can no longer like bend the world around the people that I want to work with. Now I have to like change the people that I work with, including myself, to fit what we're trying to do in the world, and that's emotionally painful. But it doesn't really matter if it's painful or not. You're not in it to have fun, in it to make a difference for the world. And I think doing it well turns out to be very fulfilling and very satisfying, even if it's a difficult thing day to day. But early on, I just didn't have that luxury. It's not like I had like any sort of traction or money or idea, and I could just afford to hire the co-founders. It was the people that I wanted to work with. And it's dangerous working with your friends because you lose your friends. Like you will. It's inevitable. The alternative, I think, is much worse. The alternative is not working with your friends, which seems kind of bizarre to me. So, I had a really interesting conversation a few years ago. I got some advice from Steve Ballmer, the previous CEO of Microsoft, which actually kind of cool. I was in Korea speaking at a conference, and I saw that he was on the agenda speaking after me, and I had never met him, and I wanted to see if he would talk to me. So I just guessed his email address, and I sent him an email just guessing what his email address would be, and turned out, I guessed right, and he said, yeah, come over, talk anytime, and he was like the most generous person, with his time. I just asked him, we didn't talk shop at all. I just asked him, well, we didn't talk like about specific business. I just asked him a bunch of CEO advice. He was super thoughtful about that. Totally not like his public image. And he said a really cool thing to me. He said, you know, you only get about 100 people in your life. He said, and it's different for some people. Some people may only get 30. Some people may get, 150. But let's just say you get like 100 people in your life total. In your entire life, you get the 100 most important people that like you're going to keep going back to time and time again for like everything important. And once you're sort of full up, like you don't get to replace them. Like once you've had your 100, like there's no more space. You're topped off. And the trick is to realize that before you've burned through all 100. He said, and a lot of people, like by the time you're out of college, you just burned through 50. And like if you're never going to see those people again, like you just wasted half of your fuel tank. Realize that fairly early, and then just try to like structure your life so that as much as possible, like you're doing things with a circle of people. And some of them you work with, others he said, you're not directly like working with, but you keep doing deals with, and you keep going back and forth to. And he just said, just be mindful about like who is this, like who is your crew, from a really early, age. Like if there are people who like if you're in school right now and there's like classmates of yours who you're like, yeah, like I can totally see like working with these people for the rest of my life, like do that, and like really try to make opportunities to fit that crew. Because at some point, yeah, you just sort of run out, and you're sort of full up, and you're just not going to get high impact people that you can really like embrace and make a core part of your life. And I think I'm on like 73 at this point. So I still have a little bit of room, but I'm trying to be very selective. And that was really good advice when I thought about it. And it sort of mirrored, like all good advice, it was basically telling me something that I felt, oh yeah, I've already been doing that. That's kind of, I think, the hallmark of when you hear something that you like, it's because it just reinforces something that you've already kind of thought. And I've been with the same crew of people more or less since college. And then every company we add a few more, and we add a few more, and we add a few more, so that now like if I was to go and do something totally different, there's like 72 people that I would be calling, to go and do it with me. And out of them probably 20 would come. And that's like a huge asset. So you should really try to develop that and to build the opportunity around those people.
Okay, we have time for one last quick question. So there was a gentleman here in the blue shirt.
Hello, thank you for wonderful talk. What are the prospects of Evernote? So you've touched a bit on that. So
the prospects?
Yeah, in terms of product. Yeah, productivity software and product.
Well, we want to make. So I think we want to make productivity tools. We want to make products that make you more productive. And very specifically, I think that the way to do that is to knock down the barriers between previous products that try to make you more productive. What I mean by that is the old paradigm was based around these very physical ideas, very physical concepts. Productivity in software started maybe 30, 40 years ago, around Microsoft Office and a little bit before. And the creators of our industry 30 years ago, they were forced with this really big challenge. They had to figure out, like, how do we get people who have never heard of computers? 30, 40 years ago, most people had no idea what digital technology was, what computers were. How do we get these people to understand what you can do with computers? And to solve this problem, they reached for really familiar physical metaphors. And so we got files and desktops and folders and slides. Like the whole idea of PowerPoint as like slides, like all of that comes from this very physical, this very cognitively skeuomorphic world where you take physical ideas and concepts and you try to translate them to technology. And in that world, everything is a separate tool. Like you have your typewriter, and your typewriter doesn't care what you're typing on it. Like it's the same tool that you're using for writing your dissertation at Oxford, or really bad poetry, or a recipe. And it actually turns out that when you think about it, like those three things, a dissertation, a really bad poetry, or a recipe, are like three totally different things. And why, like, you just happen to use the same tool to make them because that is a mechanical and physical restriction and limitation. So you have like a typewriter as a separate tool, and then you have like a filing cabinet as a separate tool. And then when you want to talk on the phone, you have a telephone as a separate tool. And like your typewriter is not your filing cabinet and it's not your telephone. But it doesn't have to be that way. Those are just cognitively skeuomorphic ideas that people needed 30 years ago because their brains would explode otherwise. But we've had an entire generation of people that don't need these crutches. In fact, that think the physical concepts are a little bit strange, that are intimately familiar with digital concepts, And I think the next generation of products, or productivity products, of which Evernote wants to be the embodiment of, are products that don't have these distinctions, where it's the same experience of writing is the same as the experience of finding and storing. It's the same as the experience of talking. And you kind of do it all in an interconnected way, all designed by one group, not by 3 separate designers, and working across every product, across your PC, but also your phone, but also your watch and your glasses, and eventually your brain implant. All of these things just functioning together. We really want, I think, Arthur C. Clarke, I think it was Arthur C. Clarke, the sci-fi writer, has this great quote that said, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? I think some of you guys have heard this. I think the guiding principle for technology companies ought to be the converse of that, which is a technology distinguishable from magic is insufficiently advanced. Like, if what you make doesn't seem magical, you're not trying hard enough. So what we want to make at Evernote is something that feels like it gives you superpowers, like it's magical, like you're all of a sudden the most productive person in the world, but you're doing it with our products, with our technology.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you.